Happy New Year, everyone, and welcome to the G20 Interfaith Forum's first webinar for 2022 on racism in the media, manufacturing hate. My name is Audrey Kitagawa, and I'm the chair of the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Interfaith Forum. The G20 Interfaith Forum gives a voice to religious actors and leaders, allowing them to seek global solutions to our world's pressing challenges. Through annual summits and regional consultations, religious thought leaders and political representatives meet together to seek consensus on ways to work together to create solutions and positive change. The mandate of the Anti-Racism Initiative of the G20 Interfaith Forum, which we call the IF20, is to remain sensitive to the impact of racism as a cross-cutting issue for the IF20 and G20 comprehensively, especially in the G20's pursuit of full compliance with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The Anti-Racism Initiative strives to continuously develop sensitivity to racism within the scope of this interfaith forum, to discern and to name the presence of racism as an issue for the Interfaith Forum and the G20, and to advise the Interfaith Forum working groups on racial discrimination and inequity as applicable to their work. The initiative assumes explicit responsibility within the IF20 to work towards the eradication of racism as a standing item for both the IF20 and the G20 agendas, and to work towards advancing the goal of racial equality and equity by every means available. I am pleased to bring together our esteemed moderator and panelists whose life's work has been to address racism, contribute to our understanding of its causes, analyze the power dynamics underlying it, its effects, and exploring the ways of justice to redress it. The biographical sketches of each of our panelists and our moderator have been placed on the flyers and, as you read, in the waiting room before the commencement of this webinar, and will also be placed in the chat box for all of our viewers to see. Our panelists are Milton Allimadi, Keisha Bush, Dotsei Malor, and Nisrin Elamin. I turn now to our moderator, Dr. Ganoune Diop, who was my predecessor as chair of the Anti-Racism Initiative, a highly respected scholar, historian, and a man who practices and lives by principles of his faith. Dr. Diop, I now turn the floor over to you.
Thank you so much, Ms. Kitagawa, Audrey, if I may say, for your kind words of introduction. I would like to share my screen this way. By way of introduction, it would be, I guess, useful to share a few slides to make this introduction relevant to our topic. So, let me just use my screen here. All right. One of the greatest challenges of our time is the revisiting of what it means to be human and humane. How we view and speak of others can contribute to life, saving lives, and healing, or, on the contrary, narratives and representations of others can be vehicles and even weapons of violence, harm, and death. The perpetuation of the myth of racial hierarchy, racial superiority, racial inferiority, and the use of narratives and visuals to demean Black people, indigenous peoples, and peoples of color, BIPOC usually, have been indulged or deliberately promoted in media outlets. A different way of relating to all human beings, grounded on a new paradigm that affirms the dignity of all humans in solidarity, is urgently needed for a better human relations. So exploring pathways to a decent way of being human will be the focus of this webinar. But why a focus on media? Racism could not be woven into the fabric of the whole ecosystem of dominant worldviews, meaning, values, fashions, and trends without the complicity of the media and media constructed and supposed ideal models. Though appearing benign in the context of general information sharing, news and media outlets, documentaries, award ceremonies, and entertainment, the content of visuals have not been neutral when it comes to picturing role models. The deliberate casting of minorities or majorities of color into supporting roles, for example, have deprived the human family of healthy human relations. So the matrix of dominations forged in eras of colonialism and perpetrated during coloniality, for example, could not spread its global tentacles without the relentless propaganda of Eurocentric supremacism through the media. Colorism has been an overt vehicle in plain sight to ensure that Black people, indigenous people, and people of color would remain far from representations of a supposed ideal. So experts from multidisciplinary competency will point to and unweave the threads that make the web of justifications for discriminations, marginalization, and promotion of ethnic superiority. So the webinar will also aim at debunking the myth of polygenesis, the curse of Black people, the mark of Cain, and other criminal interpretations of sacred text. So a perpetuation of a destructive myth can only be seen as an instrument of hate, violence, death, and even genocide. So the organizers of this webinar hope to contribute to point people of all ethnic backgrounds to what can correct perceptions and give access to true and full humanity to all human beings. The future of peaceful coexistence in the dignity of difference calls for healthy human relations healed from centuries of stigmatization and transgenerational trauma. So the decolonization of minds is not a luxury, but a necessity for peace to prevail. Decoloniality in reference to media is a must in the process. But definitions of terms first may be useful. What are we really talking about when referring to racism? Racism is a multifaceted phenomenon. It starts at an individual level with the phenomenon called internalized dominance. Now, this pride of superiority turns into a web-constructed racial hierarchy that establishes a matrix of dominations. In turn, the matrices of domination spread globally into various ecosystems of dominions. So this racist construction of human relations affect all aspects of human experience. It could not be integrated in people's subconscious minds without overt and subliminal messaging from the medium of building a cultural system of reference, Eurocentric hegemony, for example. When addressing racism, then, its systemic, multifaceted dimensions should not be lost out of sight. So a comprehensive, multi-layered approach only will do justice to this unjust, structural, institutional ecosystem of hate. So three things may be then kept in mind when we talk about racism: internalized dominance, a matrix of dominations, and ecosystems of dominions. And I would like now to say the following. Excuse me, yes. Suffice it to say that healing, reconciliation, and restoration of healthy human relations, the media can also become an instrument to restore the truth of one humanity in equality, in dignity, and in solidarity. I have briefly highlighted the problems and possible pathways to heal human relations, pointing to the key role the media can play to restore the truth of one humanity. But each of our distinguished panelists will enrich all of us with their unique insights and contributions to our conversations, dialogue, and consultation for concrete plans of action to at the least, bring awareness of biases in the media and hopefully improve the way the whole human family is portrayed and should be referred to truthfully in accordance with their full humanity and in all dignity, equality, and even honor. So I'm very much privileged today to be able to introduce each of our distinguished panelists and give the floor to each one of them to help us better understand in terms of diagnosis, but also bring concrete solution on how we can help transform the media from being an instrument of hate to now an adjuvant, helpful to bring about better human relations in all dignity, equality, and justice. So I would like then to call Mrs. Keisha Bush, who would then now take the floor. Thank you so much. So Keisha is a writer and an artist, author of the famous recorded now tool, No Heaven for Good Boys. So Keisha, please, your turn. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ganoune. Your presentation was really good and really just touched on, I think, where we all are when we look at the media, or where many people are. So as a writer and an artist, I'm going to just sort of speak at first from my experience with American publishing. So my book has been published with Random House, which is part of the Penguin Random House family. And, you know, when I decided to switch careers and move from, you know, the international development sector, I worked with Oxfam Great Britain. And before that, I was working with sort of the corporate sector, nonprofit here in the US. My book takes place and is about a story in Senegal, in Dakar, Senegal. And I lived there for 4 years. And when I approached my desire and passion to write fiction, what came forth was this very real, very current human rights crisis with the Taliban in Senegal. And these children are often forced to beg, and it's a system of abuse. Well, when I decided to write the book, I was very cognizant of how books about Asia, Africa, and anyone outside of the sort of Western Anglo-Saxon, you know, space or narrative, how writers are often not African. I mean, it's getting better now where people can write their own stories and those stories are actually published, but it's still very difficult to be a non-Anglo-Saxon person writing about anything, and especially stories about Africa or Asia or anyone outside, again, of the Western sphere, and actually get book deals. And when we do get book deals, we are not paid equitably, so we don't get the same advances. And often, and I was very like hardcore about this. There is no white savior and no heaven for good boys. There's no white person that comes in, no Anglo-Saxon person that comes in and saves the Taliban, saves, you know, Africa or the African people. And, you know, the narratives that we have been taught have always portrayed brown people and Black people as not having agency, not having the ability to tell our own stories, to live our lives, that we are not smart enough, we are not savvy enough to just be these equitable human beings. And so, because there is no Western savior in the story, and the heroes in the story are Senegalese, African people, brown people, I actually, how can I say this in a gentle way? The book was acquired in 2016, and it took 5 years, 3 imprints, and 5 editors to finally get the chance, my turn, to have the book come out and be released. And when it did get its chance, a few weeks before my release date, I was bummed for Governor Cuomo's book, his memoir on how he saved New York from the pandemic. And, on the publishing end, they realized and knew that it was very controversial, but went ahead with it anyway, and to celebrate this sort of, Anglo-Saxon hero. And, my marketing was pulled, and the book came out very quietly, but has been doing well on its own. And I see myself in terms of, as a writer, pushing against, I saw this as my role from the very beginning, of pushing against the barriers, or pushing against sort of the wall that is erected around us or in front of us when we are trying to publish and get our stories out. On the publishing end of things, there's often the conversation of how do you even market a non-Anglo-Saxon writer? And marketing and PR teams sit around, and the publishing industry is homogeneously white. They've done, there are surveys and studies, but so you have these all white teams that sit around and say, well, and I know this doesn't sound like it's real, but it is, who's the prettiest? Especially when it comes to female authors. And if you don't fit in what tends to be the benchmark is Anglo-Saxon beauty, which is blonde, a size 4, and as young as possible. So then, that literally leaves brown, BIPOC, disabled, anyone who does not fit this homogenous, very narrow ideal of who is marketable. And, the truth is I don't know many writers who started writing and wanted to publish because they wanted to be on TV. We're not trying to be actors or dancers. Now we have to go on TikTok and do dancing videos. I refuse to do that to sell our books. But the history of white supremacy, the history of the media being used as propaganda and as a weapon still is very alive today. And when conversations ensue about diversity needed in publishing, it's, a comment was made by a very senior person within publishing, we give the people what they want. Well, if you've been feeding the people the same thing, the same stories coming from the same people and excluding everyone else out, well, then the assumption is that is what they want. And social media is a perfect example. Social media is impacting everyone right now. It's shortening our attention spans, and it's training our brains in a negative way. So why would media not somehow be separate from what the detriment of social media is having on our global society, on our global community? So regular and traditional media is in that same space. It just hasn't been highlighted as much because it's of the groups who have been affected by that. And I'll close there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Keisha. We will come back to you, obviously, during the Q&A times. Now, I would like to ask, actually, if Ben would come right now and share with us. Ben, please, this is your time at this point.
Okay, Jeff, thank you, and thank you to Ms. Audrey Kitagawa, the organizers, and to my brother Milton. Thank you, Keisha, and also Nisrin. My dear friends, I spent 12 years working with the BBC in London. And then about 18 years ago, I got an offer to come and work at the United Nations in New York. I want to make about 3 or 4 observations, and then also offer 3 recommendations or solutions. First of all, can we just acknowledge, can anyone who cares, anyone with authority in the media, the question is racism in the media real? Does it exist? Does it have impact and consequences? And my firm answer is going to be yes to all this. First, we have to acknowledge that racism in the media is real. It has been real. And not only has it been real, racism in the media has had disastrous, damaging, and costly consequences. And I'm going to take you to the first example that is affecting all of us right now. I understand that some of us are probably dealing with COVID-19 directly right now. As I speak with you, in late November 2021, diligent, excellent, experienced scientists in South Africa managed to identify a new variant of the COVID-19 disease that is going around, and they call it Omicron. And in the spirit of transparency, they immediately put this out to the world. Instead of these scientists being applauded for their excellence, their openness, the reporting of this development resulted in several nations, the United States included, putting travel bans on South Africa. Instead of South Africa being recognized and rewarded for the identification of this, the reporting in the media, even to the point where South Africa, together with 8 neighboring countries, had to suffer from the travel ban. And as I talk to you, there is a new story that has just come out today on the BBC, and it's got the question, has South Africa, or was South Africa ignored over mild Omicron evidence? If you go there now to the BBC, this story is one of the top stories at the BBC. And the second paragraph of the story says, 2 of South Africa's most prominent coronavirus experts told the BBC that Western skepticism about their work could be construed as racist, or at least a refusal to believe the science because it came from Africa. This is just one poignant example that is going on now. The South African president had to come on video and television and call on the world at a time that 70% of Omicron cases were in the UK. The UK was putting a travel ban on African countries. And if you remember, in 2014, there was an Ebola epidemic in just 3 countries in West Africa. Out of the 54 nations of Africa, Ebola was in just 3 countries: Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea. And Nairobi, or Dar es Salaam, far to the east of the continent, several thousands of kilometers away, tourists started canceling their flights and their trips to those places. The same thing applied to South Africa and Botswana, countries that depend a lot on tourist expenditure in those countries. And so that takes me to a personal experience. I am a Ghanaian, but my wife is from Trinidad and Tobago. A few years ago, I was in Trinidad and Tobago, and I was there with one of my wife's cousins. This is an educated man. It happened to be a time of the Summer Olympics. We were watching television, and the Kenyans were ruling in the steeplechase and in the long distances. And this relative of mine, or of my wife's, turned to me and said, "Ben, you are from Africa. Can you run?" And I said, "No, I'm from Ghana, West Africa. We are not as good as the East Africans." So I said, "Why did you ask?" He said, "Oh, every time we watch television here in the Caribbean, in Trinidad and Tobago, all we saw were Africans running." What I'm saying is the damaging effects of the single story was so bad that even for Black people, somebody in the Caribbean is viewing me, an African, within that one single story. Africans are only good at running. And I'm talking about somebody who is Black. So the damaging effect is not limited to just the Western world and the developing world. Even among us, there are African Americans going to Ghana and wondering if people are living on trees. You talk to Africans who go to school here, they will tell you that. And I could go on and mention Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie and the danger of the single story. She says, show a people as one thing, as only one thing, over and over again, and that's what they become, and rob people of their dignity. So 3 points as solutions. The Western media must exercise conscientious balance. NPR and CNN cannot be covering Nigeria through their correspondents based in Johannesburg. Number 2, we Africans, until the lion tells the story, the hunter will always be glorified. Africans must tell and retell their stories using the internet, using social media, using Nollywood, the Nigerian film industry. And maybe, third point, we probably need a Pan-African media house with television and everything. And I'll end on that point. Thank you for listening.
Thank you so much, Ben. So again, we will give you an opportunity to expand on some aspects of your presentations, and we will be, of course, welcoming questions from the audience, the viewers, the participants. So next, I would like to ask Milton, and by the way, the biographies have been posted. So that's why I'm not staying too much time in order to capitalize the time we have together to really give you an opportunity to share with us and make a significant contribution to the topic of the day. So Milton, this will be the time. So now we can see you. Thank you so much. Welcome. The floor is yours, please.
Thank you so much. Thank you for hosting this very critical and important event. Greetings to all the participants, sisters and brothers. When we talk about racism in media, we cannot isolate it or disassociate it from the owners of media. Media serves the interest of the owners or the ruling class. It's historically always been that way. So media will always defend their interest and their agenda. So we cannot address the issue of racism in media without addressing the racism that is also maintained by the ruling class. And that is the issue that I tackled in my book, Manufacturing Hate: How Africa Was Demonized in Western Media. I would like all of the participants to ask yourself, how is it that Africa and Africans have been historically, and even in our contemporary times, portrayed as backward people, portrayed as savage people? And on the other hand, it is the resources of Africa that enabled the Western world to industrialize. Without the resources of Africa, the factories in Europe would not have been able to produce the goods that has created so much wealth for the European world and in recent era for the United States as well. So something is not adding up. And that is why I chose the title Manufacturing Hate, because we are not dealing with individual racism that we can address on an individual basis. We are talking about a global system that was carefully and deliberately constructed in order to enable exploitation of non-Europeans. So we can go back as the era of slavery and enslavement, when millions of Africans were kidnapped from the continent and taken to the New World to exploit their labor on the plantations. So why was media important? Because obviously you have to convince the European citizenry in Europe and in the New World that these individuals that we are treating like animals on the plantations, the lynchings, the castration, the quartering, are not really human beings like the rest of us, and make it acceptable. So it was important for media to justify and rationalize. So therefore, media, in fact, was one of the most important weapons and has been the most important weapon in the history of exploitation of other human beings. So then, when the era of slavery was no longer able to be maintained because it was a challenge to global capitalism, because capital would like to exploit labor freely, and you cannot have them confined on the plantations. So now we had the new form of slavery, which was colonialism, which was a global phenomenon. But in my case, obviously I'm focusing on Africa. So once again, it was important to condition the mindset of Europeans that the reason why we are going to Africa to seize the land, to ethnically cleanse in order to seize the land and to take over resources, is because they are not human beings like the rest of us. They are backward. They are savages. They need to be civilized by we Europeans. So that is why the literature produced by the so-called explorers became very critical. People like Samuel Baker. These are Europeans who came all the way from Europe and found lakes, rivers, mountains, and countries, arrogantly renamed them after the monarchs in Europe. And by the way, they were led to those locations to make the discoveries by Africans. But at the same time that they were demonizing Africans, in the case of Samuel Baker, for example, he said Africans should not be compared with the noble character of the dog. And yet at the same time, he was writing in the same book that we need to benefit commercially from Africa. And that is why I go back to the title of the book, Manufacturing Hate, constructing this animus, hatred toward richly melanated people. I never use the term dark people or dark-skinned people. There's nothing negative about being richly melanated. That is the term I prefer. So they created this narrative of a backward, savage people that needed European dominance. And then they invaded. With the Maxim gun, they were able to overwhelm African resistance. But the Maxim gun was not the most important weapon, I maintain. It was demonization. Because now you make it acceptable to commit genocide. At the same time, you also emasculate the Africans. They start European worship, Europe worship, at the same time, internalizing their own sense of inferiority. So then, this literature that was created by the so-called explorers, they created a template that was later on adopted by the professional writers who started going to Africa. When publications such as the New York Times started sending people to Africa in the 1920s, publications like National Geographic, and then much later on, Time Magazine, Newsweek, they continued the narrative of demonization that was created by the so-called explorers. And in many cases, they actually maximized the demonization. So in my research, for example, I found a letter sent to an editor here in New York by a New York Times correspondent who was complaining to his editors, why did they manufacture an incident that he did not write about and put it in his story? And what was that incident? Of Nigerians dressed in grass leaf skirts. He never wrote about that. But his editors, wanting a tribal image of Africa, concocted it and put it in that New York Times story. And that is where we find ourselves today, dealing with the legacy of this manufactured hatred. Thank you. I will get to address other issues during the discussion and the question and answer. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you very much, Milton, for your contribution. Again, we will come back to you. Now, I would like to ask our last speaker, not the least, Nisrin Elamin, Assistant Professor of International Studies, to now take the floor. Thank you so much, Nisrin, for joining us. We are grateful. Now the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for this opportunity. I hope you can hear me. One of the questions that interests me and that is partly inspired actually by Milton's book, Manufacturing Hate, is what are the implications of racist reporting, particularly in relation to the African continent? And sitting in the United States, which as a settler colonial state relies on a particular mythology to portray itself as a beacon of justice, freedom, and democracy vis-a-vis the world, the answer to this question is partially, at least, that it shapes US foreign policy and interventions in Africa, in part because of our lack of critical engagement with the media and policymakers. And I'm going to hone in on sort of three dimensions of this. The first being the angle that newsrooms and media makers take to frame a particular story. The second is the manufacturing of expertise on African affairs. And then lastly, the ways African or Black suffering and Black victimhood is constructed, normalized, gendered, and perpetuated through the mainstream media. I'll focus mostly on Sudan because that's where I'm originally from, and because the international media has largely either misrepresented or ignored what is happening on the ground at the moment. I remember when the mainstream US and European media first started reporting about the December Revolution in Sudan, the protests were narrowly framed as bread riots. The New York Times headline read, "Sudanese protests after days of violence turn anger over bread towards Bashir," who was the then dictator who's been deposed. Sudan rocked by protests over bread hike. That was Deutsche Welle. Several people killed in Sudan, food price protests. That's TV5. This narrow framing of a powerful resistance movement and revolution as bread riots, besides being racist, played right into the hands of the Bashir regime, which was insisting that this was simply an economic crisis caused by the removal of subsidies and that these protests would dissipate once the subsidies were reinstated, as opposed to covering an incredibly powerful popular uprising against the 30-year brutal, racist, genocidal military regime. Now, according to Zachariah Mampili, there have been a staggering 90 popular, mostly pro-democracy uprisings on the African continent since 2004. And yet, well-informed people who read the New York Times or listen to NPR here in the US would not know this, because Africans demanding democracy, economic justice, etc., through non-violent grassroots resistance just does not fit the playbook, if you will, on many levels. The revolution in Sudan continues today in the aftermath of a military coup that took place recently. And as the coup regime escalates its violence against unarmed protesters, they've killed 72 people so far, we continue to see this kind of racist, inaccurate framing. A recent headline from CNN reads, "Sudan Prime Minister resigns amid violent anti-coup protests that have left 57 dead," essentially implying that the unarmed protesters are perpetrators of this violence, when it is the Sudanese military, backed by US allies in the region like the UAE and Saudi Arabia, that has been targeting and killing protesters, who are calling for a full transition to civilian rule. Again, this has emboldened international actors like the US envoy to the Horn and UN diplomats to push for negotiations within a context where these meetings between coup leaders and civilian leaders who are handpicked by the military are serving to legitimize rather than challenge the coup and the military's unconstitutional seizure of power. Because protesters have been portrayed as violent rioters in the media, the coup regime has co-opted the anti-terrorism discourse to in turn justify escalating their violent attacks against them. And negotiations within this context absolves the military of the crimes they've committed in recent period, but also over the last 30 years in Darfur, South Sudan, and other parts of the country. And so this anti-terrorism discourse aligns the coup regime with the war on terror forces who often use it, even here in the United States, to justify state-sponsored violence and repression. Similarly, last year, we saw CNN and TV5 headlines about the coup in Guinea, insisting that the only reason the coup deserved coverage was in relation to aluminum prices and mining interests. A CNN headline in September, for instance, read, "Aluminum prices hit decade high as coup threatens supplies from Guinea." A TV5 headline read, "Coup in Mali, there is no reason for the large mining corporations to be worried." I'll leave that one right there because it might as well could have been written during the French colonial occupation of Guinea. This brings me to another point, that newsrooms and media makers in the US rely heavily on experts that are tied to or consult for state entities or corporations in the West, like the State Department, the CIA, etc., to make sense of African affairs. And this has helped strengthen ideas around what expertise looks like, not only marginalizing African analysts, scholars, and activists, which of course also shapes the kinds of solutions that are then envisioned for the African continent and imposed by multilateral donors, etc. But perhaps even more dangerously, this has led to the manufacturing of crises in Africa, particularly in the Horn of Africa, that are entirely dehistoricized and decontextualized. So like the Horn is perpetually in crisis, and experts who comment on these crises are drawn from think tanks that are called the International Crisis Group, for example. But in following their analysis, we rarely get to understand how geopolitical forces, historical processes of empire building and marginalization shape the dynamics that underlie these crises, that elsewhere might not even be called crises in the first place. And so the final point I want to make that Milton's book also inspired me to think about is how African women in particular are portrayed, reported on, and written about by mainstream Western journalists, and what impact the combined manufacturing of misogyny and racism has on our collective imagination of what we call Africa, but also on the ways policymakers and heads of major foundations craft their funding and policy priorities. How, for instance, does the African woman and her singular experience of victimhood, besides activating a kind of white savior complex, get repeatedly used to justify the increased militarization and the expansion of the war on terror on the African continent? I remember when the Muslim ban, which is really an African ban, was first crafted, which I was detained under, the language of the ban included an entire section dedicated to explaining how the ban served to protect Muslim women from honor killings. With each iteration of the ban, more African countries were added. In fact, the criminalization of Africans became the trade-off for rolling back the ban's explicit exclusion or targeting of Muslims, and that criminalization is directly tied to the way African women are portrayed and written about in our mainstream media. I'd be happy to talk a little bit more in the Q&A about what we can do about all this, and I think one of the solutions is to create our own platforms, but I'll end right there. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your contribution, Nisrin. And thank you also for making the special effort to joining us this afternoon. Thank you so much. We are very grateful for that. Now, I would like to spend some time asking each one of the panelists, what have you heard from one another? Any clarification, any question, any expansion of what has been said? So just briefly, before we move to the next section, when we will be opening to a larger Q&A basically, and involving our participants. So I would like to maybe start with the first speaker today, Keisha. Anything you have heard from what has been said, probably starting with the introduction to the intervention of every panelist. Keisha,
yes, thank you, Ganoune. What comes forward for me is just the interconnectedness in the historical context. Just, literally from colonization on forward, and how this sort of teaching, this learning of the hierarchy of race and people, how it's just reinforced again and again and again, to the point, I think it was Ben that mentioned during his presentation, is there racism in the media? Like, what are you all talking about? And it's so deeply embedded, and everyone is taught that, right? When Nisrin talked about like this idea of how, and Ben, you mentioned it too, how Black people are right there, or brown people are right there also, with the same stereotypical ideas of what Africa looks like, or what Africans are doing, or their lives. When I was living in Senegal, I would write home about everything around me, and it really opened people's idea and understanding that Africa is full of thriving cities, entrepreneurship, beauty, fashion, music, art. And so I saw myself as sort of a window. If I don't have the ability to make a difference on a mass scale, I start within my community. I start with my family. I start with my friends. And then from there, we branch out like a web of learning. And then it doesn't feel like learning, right? Because it's coming from people that you know and trust. So that's my sort of...
Thank you so much. So next, I would like to then ask Ben, right, who was the second speaker, what have you heard, and what is it that you would like to highlight from what we have heard, actually, from the other presenters? Ben, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you. Number one, ownership of media. I think Milton brought this up. Mm-hmm. Ownership of media is going to be critical, and Nisrin also mentioned we may have to create our own platform. And let me reverse the whole thing and say this. When I was growing up in Ghana, I got exposed to Ebony magazine by the publisher John Johnson, and Ebony was a magazine that made me feel good and wonderful about African Americans. You will see these military officers, female officers in the Air Force, and it was like this glowing place of achievement, until I met an African American on the campus of the University of Ghana. And I said, wow, Ebony, you are from America. Everything is beautiful and excellent. And he burst my balloon. He said, everything you see in Ebony, what we are really going through is no, and I said, come on, positive stories. So I'm saying that ownership of the media, like what Oprah is doing right now, there are certain stories that will not go on any of Oprah's networks. I don't think they will pass and just go and be allowed, even if they sneak in. I think somebody will call them to order. So that's number one. And let me just say quickly, and I will hand over. The danger of the single story, Chimamanda Adichie Ngozi, here is something she said, and I will just give this to all of us. She said, if I hadn't grown up in Nigeria, but in the USA, and if all I knew about Africa were from popular images and the media, I too would be thinking that Africa was a place of beautiful landscapes, beautiful animals, and incomprehensible people fighting senseless wars, dying of poverty and AIDS, unable to speak for themselves and waiting to be saved by a kind white foreigner. I think Keisha alluded to that. I'll leave it there.
That is really terrible to hear, you know, when you think about it. Those are very loaded words, but we will come back to that certainly. But let me now ask Milton what he has heard and what he would like specifically to highlight of everyone's contribution, rather. Please.
Sure,
Milton.
Absolutely. Thank you. Mm-hmm. Well, Keisha spoke about who gets to define beauty. And that is very critical, representation. In fact, that is what inspired me to eventually end up writing my book. Because even before I was a teenager, my family is originally from Uganda, but I also grew up in Tanzania. And that is where I started reading a lot of Western publications in the US Information Service Center. And I noticed that Africans were always depicted as the other, as a tribal people. And that term always bothered me, tribesmen. And obviously I could not write anything or counter it at that stage. I was only 12. I had to wait years later after I gained knowledge to the research to be able to push back. But even up to now, so let me give you an example of who defines beauty, and that's very critical. During the conflict in Rwanda, it's reported as if it started in 1994 after the plane carrying the president was shot down. And by the way, when the genocidal killing started, Time magazine said the reason why it was going on was because of tribal bloodlust. This is a direct quote from Time magazine, you know, evoking the images of cannibalism. But anyway, that war had been going on for 4 years. And there was some very horrific reporting and writing in magazines like The New Yorker by one writer in particular, Alex Shumatov, who said the Tutsi were actually seen as false Africans because they resembled Europeans. So they were not really Africans. Whereas the Hutu were stocky, broad-nosed, and thick-lipped. This is the kind of racist type of depiction that we thought we had done away with in the 19th century. This is coverage in the 1990s in the New Yorker as well as the Sunday Times magazine. So that's what Keisha's comments made me think about. In terms of what Ben said, I agree with him. And you can understand why even Africans or people of African ancestry are really affected by the demonization. So I'll give you 2 quick examples. One, in Uganda, a few years ago, I read an article in the newspaper, which to me was, I understood it, but it was still unbelievable. There's a school in Uganda called Sir Samuel Baker Secondary School, the same racist Samuel Baker who said Africans should not be compared to the noble character of the dogs. Now, the graduates from that school were taking a collection, and they did raise a lot of money to build a statue, which they did, to honor Samuel Baker. Think about that. European worshiping. Instead of raising money to send Ugandans to school, they're honoring somebody who said they should not be compared to the noble character of the dog. And then in terms of what Nisrin said, I agree with her absolutely, 100%. We need to challenge them on the people they bring on to tell the African story. Who are the ones that are producing this narrative, these so-called experts? And I like the point she made that, in fact, there is indeed an organization called the International Crisis Group. I could not help but laugh when she made that comment. So those are some of the observations I made.
Thank you so much, Milton. Thank you. Now I would like to ask the same question to Nisrin. Please, could you tell us what you have heard from the other panelists? Please, your turn.
Yes. I feel like there were so many connections, and I'm going to try to sort of recap them briefly. But starting with Keisha, I really appreciated this sort of very candid, maybe access or insight into the sort of structural racist barriers that exist within the publishing world. And, you know, so because it's something that we don't get to hear as much about, and clearly people aren't going to be covering that as much. And yet what it reminds me of is that these barriers really don't serve anybody, right? In the end, it's by removing them that we'll just get a much more sort of accurate and sort of rich portrayal of life, right? If we remove them. And I think, you know, similarly to one of the points that Milton made, I think to me, this is about racial capitalism, right? This is about the ways in which, and Cedric Robinson talks about this in his work, but the ways in which colonial divisions have been kind of seized upon to devalue certain people's lives in order to make a profit. And racist reporting really falls within that, right? In what ways can the sort of racist framing and angles that we see being taken be seen as serving capitalist interests, right? And how that is part of sort of the project of racial capitalism that we need to be dismantling. You know, so I think about, for example, I spoke about the Muslim ban. Ben talked about the travel ban on African countries, who really should have been applauded for discovering the Omicron variant. And in both of these cases, it was like, you know, we're keeping disease-ridden Africans out of the country, or we're keeping terrorist Africans out of the country. And we were sort of all, with a broad stroke, sort of, you know, considered to be a threat in some ways to the United States, right? And you know, the reality of it is that certainly if you talk to a Somali in Mogadishu or sort of neighboring areas, and you ask about U.S. threats, they have a lot more, like U.S. drone wars are real, right? And there's a lot more sort of a U.S. threat present through the militarization of the African continent for African citizens than it is certainly for American citizens in relation to Africa. So I think there's a way in which that kind of manufacturing as well. I didn't see many people when these bans were kind of erected really challenge that aspect of it. It was like, you know, we should, why aren't certain countries on the list, or, you know, but that's not the point. The point is not to expand this kind of racist banning of anybody. The point is to question the entire premise of what is happening. We need to tax the rich and vaccinate the world. It's as simple as that, you know, and that's when we're really going to get out of this pandemic. And really, we should be blaming the wealthy countries for not, you know, pulling their weight in making that happen.
So much, Nisrin. You know, I would like to, I will come back to you, of course, with the questions from the audience, viewers, and participants. I would like at this point, before we move to that section, just mention something that I think linger beneath all this in terms of historical injustices. What is happening today is certainly the result of actually centuries, right? Of framing, of shaping. So this is why when we talk about racism, we're talking about system, but that was constructed. Let me take you back to a date, 1884. What happened? Infamous date, this was the Berlin Conference. Right, 1884, the partition of Africa, where European nation at that time decided, just to take an example, King Leopold II, well, Congo belongs to him, etc., the partition of Africa. But people got to that point, though, because also at that time, we cannot necessarily talk about the media, but philosophers also started publishing some of the ideas about the inferiority of Africans. And here, of course, you know, people, this is why what has happened, for example, in America, we have writers of the Declaration of Independence, you know, I mean, lofty words, wonderful, but at the same time, owning slaves, so it's like light and darkness in the same person or something like that, or people rather. And then we can think the same thing. Philosophers were publishing, and you name it, Immanuel Kant. I mean, it's absolutely wonderful contributions, for example, in the history of thought and so forth. Immanuel Kant, David Hume, Darwin, John Locke, horrible statements about Africans, right? And I think all this prepared to where we are today, that the Europeans started looking at Africans, right, a certain way. And the media, of course, came to reinforce, to shape. This is why we're talking about an ecosystem of demonization of Africans. I mean, of course, and largely people of color, in the sense, of course, without forgetting the indigenous people. Now, I would like to open the floor to question, and I'm going to the Q&A. There are several here who made, and the first one, let me just maybe read it and ask. The first one was addressed to Keisha, but it is open. If you have, please give us brief responses, insights. So the first one, thank you, Keisha, for your humorous, candid sharing about what is not right with the media and publishing as it relates to all real people. Now the question, how can we help change this? And what can we do to make it more real and integrated? Any response to that first question?
Yes, there is a movement with the pandemic over the last 2 years and the push of Black Lives Matter. You had all these companies coming forward, doing a Black Lives Matter post on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and saying that they stand with people, and brown people and Black people, people of color. But then there was pushback to that, because that was very like I could just take an ad out, but what is the real work that's happening? And so they're kind of like an inchworm. I see it as that more editors of color and editors that are pushing diverse stories forward, because that could be anyone of any background, racial background, and class background. So that's happening, along with sort of a reckoning of sorts of the fact that publishing in of itself is lacking diversity. It's lacking people from different backgrounds. And so how do we even get these stories out? In terms of finding stories from authors who are not the authors that are being perpetuated and pushed forward, which tend to be Anglo-Saxon, that tend to fit within this box of who's, beautiful enough. It's almost like you have to be a super sleuth in some cases, but there are platforms that exist, like the African American Literature Book Club. Their website is AALBC. I think it's .org or .com. There are book clubs like there's Well Read Black Girl, Anne-Marie's book club. She has a celebrity book club. And what I like about it is she doesn't just go with the books that are being promoted by publishers, because the publishers definitely go through this, like, who's, pretty enough, who's young enough. And then there's, like your indie bookstores. You can Google what are the indie Black bookstores that are promoting books also. It's really interesting. It's, for me, as someone who reads across the spectrum, it's difficult for me to find books by authors. Like, I recently wanted to read more about like books from Korean writers. And I'm like, how do I even find Korean writers writing about Korea? I'm like, man, I got to go on this super sleuth sort of thing. And as writers and as people, we need to constantly be questioning our own work. So with No Heaven for Good Boys, I was not born in Africa. I was born in the US. And And I'm not Senegalese. So I was very aware that I was writing the story of Senegalese people, a Senegalese story, and that I could not take anything for granted. I was the other coming in, and I had to come in respectfully. And so questioning ourselves, what we've been taught, is really, really important and really the first step, because it's easy to just fall into stereotypes and predetermined from what we've seen on TV. And that's not benefiting any of us at all. And I'll leave it there because I can talk about this all night.
Thank you so much. And I will, thank you so much, Keisha. I will move on to another question here. And it is as follows. Recognizing that media is a tool of and at once a link in the systemic chain of racism, one must acknowledge the roles of education and religion in the creation and maintenance of racist media. Will you speak to the best points of engagement and best approaches for change? Anyone of the other panelists now, and I will come back to you, Keisha.
Maybe I can try for a minute. Thank you, Dr. Diop. Media is a tool of and a link in the systemic chain of racism in terms of education and religion. Let me say this. I am a person of faith who believes that if it were not for the faith of the ancestors who were kidnapped and brought over here, it would have been much worse. They would have been totally decimated. So I'm a person of faith. I'm along the lines of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, whose birthday and National Day we've been celebrating. So I have to, maybe nail my flag to the mast that way. And when sometimes people, much as we respect traditional African religion, and I come from a background of strong traditional African religion, and people question Christianity, that the Europeans brought Christianity, I think it's a complete fallacy. It's a mix of fallacies, because if you go to Ethiopia, you will see that Ethiopians have been for ages practicing the Christian faith. And if Ethiopia has managed to resist the domination of the European powers, especially, let's say, Italy, then there is something there. Then again, let me mention quickly from my own experience as someone who worked in the BBC for 12 years. I was a Pan-Africanist, but I was conscious of the fact that we were constantly being criticized for being negative concerning Africa. And why? Because in many newsrooms, even up till today, there is that phrase determining the top story. If it bleeds, then it leads. And let me give you an example. If we have two correspondents of the BBC, let's say in Senegal, one of them is calling us and saying that the African Development Bank has just financed this big bridge across the Gambian River, and the times that people spend with their goods and their travel is going to be cut from 1 week or 2 weeks to 4 hours. That is a great story for me as a Pan-African. But when I'm in the newsroom, another correspondent comes to say, oh, we've had 22 Africans, migrants, perish off the coast of Senegal because they were trying to reach Europe. Now, if we have slot for just one story, tell me which story ends up being used. So these were some of the realities. In fact, at a point, we decided at the BBC in the African service that we should look for positive stories. One of my South African brothers criticized and said, we are not calling it positive. We're just looking for real African stories that happen to be positive. My final point is this. Today, the chances of Africa or Africans working against the entrenched racism in the media, the chances are brighter because we have the internet, we have social media, we can tell our own stories more and repeat them. and we have thriving film industries, let's say in Nigeria, Nollywood. Nollywood has helped my Caribbean relatives of my wife, to see that Nigeria is not just internet scam and all that. There are nice, beautiful buildings and whatever. Even among fellow Africans, we are using the films from Nollywood to get to just see that, look, we have much more than what we have been told and we have. And I guess the story then remains again until the lion begins to tell his story. The hunter will always be glorified. Thank you.
I'd like to add to what Ben said. Ben actually touched a lot on the points that I had, but I want to make one other observation. And goes back to how I started off. Media represent the interest of the ruling class.
Milton.
So when the conflict...
Sorry, may I just add one question so that you can also
absolutely
answer both? This way, that will save us time, because I am looking at the time
absolutely
that we have left. So a question was asked directly to you. Okay, during your research, have you come across sources that would be concluded as racist ideas about African traditional religions? Okay, so the question is to Milton Allimadi. So you can incorporate that eventually. Now, being mindful of the time that we have.
Absolutely. The quick answer to that, of course, is yes. And I think the best person who has dealt with that quite effectively is, of course, the late Professor Diop. Mm-hmm. And if anyone has not yet read that book, African Origin of Civilization, please, I urge you to read that book. He addressed those issues very effectively, much better than I ever could even hope to address. The other point that I wanted to make was that when media, corporate media, refer to conflict in the Congo as tribal war, there's a purpose behind that, because it's actually shielding the fact that this is actually a very profitable war, the so-called tribal war. So the conflict that raged in the Congo from 1997 in particular, all the way to the contemporary era, the major corporate media were not telling readers that Western companies were benefiting, making hundreds of millions of dollars or even billions of dollars from this conflict. They're focusing on the killing and blaming it on the Congolese, when in fact the invasion of the Congo from Uganda and Rwanda was condoned by the West, including the United States. Mm-hmm. And during this fighting, when people are being killed, resources were being plundered from Eastern Congo by well-established major corporations. And the United Nations identified all these companies and listed them, and even up to date, they're on the website of the United Nations. So this is when media is completely irresponsible, serving the interest of the corporate ruling class and blaming the Congolese for the conflict in order to mask the fact that corporate interests are actually profiting from the genocidal war that they're actually promoting in the Congo. So I wanted to make that observation. And another quick point, in terms of what can we do, one of the participants asked that question. Engage them, challenge the writers, challenge the editors, challenge the publishers, write to them, either individually or as a group. And it does have impact. And I speak from my own experience engaging with them. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Milton. Now, I will, well, maybe as a footnote, Milton has recommended reading Cheikh Anta Diop. You know, I grew up in the same family reading about this, but more importantly, I think when we talk about racism and thinking about Africa, usually, or even slavery, we tend to single-handedly think about transatlantic slavery. But we should remember that you have, before transatlantic slavery, by the way, my family traces back to the 14th century. So in the village even exists still today where my great-grandparents lived in Senegal. And actually, interestingly, and and this should be, I think, remembered when we talk about slavery. Before the 15th century, there were the 7th century. You know, you have the trans-Saharan slavery, right, by the Arab Muslims at the time, and also the Oriental slavery. Of course, the intra-African slavery and the Sultanate of Sokoto, for example. I think people ought to know. Even at the UN, when we talk, you know, like March 25th, commemoration of slavery, people only think about the transatlantic. So the suffering, you know, like demonization of Africa, and even today. And this is also one thing that I would like to highlight. Media can be recognized in what it says, but it also can be recognized in what it doesn't say. There is a conspiracy of silence, for example, in the Middle East about, right, the marginalization of people of African descent. And I think this is, now, another point quickly, when we talk about European bringing Christianity to Africa, that's almost laughable, I mean, respectfully, because Ethiopia was mentioned, certainly, but we can think of Africa also as being a continent of hospitality. I mean, for Egypt was part of Africa and still is, and I think people forget that. So Jesus came to Africa. Muhammad, the prophet of Islam, you know, sent his followers actually to Abyssinia, the same thing, to find refuge there. So a land of refuge in that sense. So let me maybe now we have about 20, yes, barely 12 minutes. But I would like to maybe just read the following. Thank you for this forum. I'm going to read some of the statement for all of us to hear. Thank you for this forum to help me understand more about the created racism in the media. I come from an old school where you consider the news, magazine, and newspapers as bringing the truth or uncovering the story. My heart hurts to hear the truth, and yet I feel empowered that change starts with me and ripples out. Look forward to more specific things I can do. So thank you so much. I would like to just, Nisrin, I would like to ask you to add more of your insights having this rich experience and background understanding of Sudan and the region and beyond, of course, because of your own competence. Could you please intervene now and expand a little bit more? Thank you.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think I wanted to sort of go back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier and touch on education, because I'm a professor, and for me, a lot of this has to start in the classroom. By the time I get students, mostly American students, in my international politics class, I find out that they have the only book that they've read, perhaps in relation to Africa, is The Heart of Darkness by Joseph Conrad, which is one of the most racist texts ever written, right? So, you know, you can just imagine. And then they come to college and the sort of canon, and this is also in very sort of prestigious institutions that I've been a part of, the canon is still considered sort of to exclude any kind of thought from the global South, right? So theory is produced in the North, in the West, and not in the global South. And I think that's really partly where we need to start, and not just sort of tokenizing, you know, Fanon or even Mbembe, but really to kind of take the African Academy seriously and to think about knowledge production and sort of theory as from a much less kind of Eurocentric and US-centric perspective. And so for me, what I've done is I've just basically created all of my syllabi centering theorists from the global South, and people come out of those classes with a kind of the theoretical tools to then critically engage with the world and with the media. And I think that's partly where it needs to start. I mean, when I was growing up, I used to hear news about Ghana and Sudan both gained their independence in 1956, and we would hear about each other through the BBC, right, which at the time was a lot wider than it is today. And I would hear that gong from the Buckingham Palace, you know, and to me that is very problematic, right? In the same way that I have to fly through London or Paris to get from Khartoum to Dakar, for example, I'm getting my news about my African brothers and sisters from our colonial, you know, former colonial masters. And so for me, again, creating our own platforms, even in the left media in the United States, there is a dearth of producers who are experts or come from Africa, right? Or come from the African diaspora. And so for me, we have to do our due diligence and find sources. I rely on Radio Dabanga, for example, to get my news about Sudan. But I have to ask my, West African friends, for example, how do I get better news about what's happening in Guinea? How do I get the sort of backstory to what's happening in Mali? And that takes a little bit of work. And I think we all need to commit ourselves to doing that because we sit in the belly of the beast where these policies are sort of crafted that then have this huge impact on people on the continent, and we need to be able to challenge them from an informed kind of point of view. And the last point I want to make about religion, one of my fears, and that I've seen sort of in the last couple of years, I lived in Tanzania for a while, is that most African countries, there are Muslims and Christians and people who adhere to African traditional religions, and for the most part, at least, again, I'm not trying to romanticize this, but we've lived in community, in respect and in tolerance of each other in ways that maybe the Europeans have not been so successful at, and yet the war on terror discourse has really pitted us against each other. And that's one of the things that I want to caution us against is to really sort of push against the demonization of our brothers and sisters on religious grounds. And the same, I think, can be true even within the Muslim community in relation to Christians and people, who follow traditional religions, is that there's a kind of demonization that emerges from a very Arab-centric sort of Saudi Wahhabi-led sort of, version of Islam. That is in its own way racist, I should say. So I just want to kind of caution us against that. Yeah.
For someone coming from Sudan, we hear you very well in terms of racism is not just like a Western phenomenon. It is that. As I mentioned with philosophers, but it's also, and we do not have time to talk about the misinterpretations of religious text, and as I mentioned, the curse of Ham, which is even not actually, in the Bible, because it was Ham, it was Canaan, who was cursed, not Ham, etc. But anyway, that story was constructed. Now, you will have each one of you 1 minute to point to participants, what is it? Like, a takeaway that you would not want people to miss in our topic. But let me just read, though, quickly, one of the questions that we don't have time to go through. Someone wrote, I would like to ask is, as Africans or people of color can create our concept of recognition through which we can analyze or critique our experiences rather than using the mainstream media categories. As someone who is in IT, it was disturbing to learn that even artificial intelligence can be racist. So this maybe I'm just probably asking us maybe to continue this conversation further, because there are areas, and as I was saying at the beginning, racism is a force that shapes the whole ecosystem, right, in which we live, affecting all aspects of human experience. So therefore, it is important that it be deconstructed, right? And even what is implied here, how can we read? This is a hermeneutical question, an interpretation issue. How do we read? Through which lenses? I think it's important for Africans and people of color and so forth to start not being deprived of their stories and their own narratives, because slavery is really taking away people's stories and reducing them to supporting roles in many areas, so this is one of the reasons why it is important that we think further. So thank you very much for your various contributions. I'm going to ask each one of you 1 minute, not more, to basically focus on takeaway. What is it that you don't want people to miss in what you have presented? Keisha, could you please conclude then with your 1 minute? Then I will pass to the others. Yes, please.
The takeaway I think I have to share with everyone is to start with self, start with self-awareness, start to question why you like the things you like. Why do you read what you read? I do little things to make myself uncomfortable. I buy a different color, or I moved to Tulsa, Oklahoma from Harlem. And it's difficult, but by challenging yourself and by questioning, we are collectively then able to push the needle forward that creates a more human world, a world that is empathetic, and a world where we see each other as full human beings. But again, you have to see yourself as a full human being that's a part of this greater collective. There's a saying within Buddhism, which I practice, I am no better, nor am I any less than any other being. And for me, that includes the animals, it includes the trees and the earth itself and every other being that's on the planet. And to support where I can other people and speak up when I have that opportunity, and to try to bring honesty as I can.
Thank you so much. All transient beings then, thank you so much. Now, Ben, your 1 minute, please.
I realize that time is against us, so I give my 1 minute to my Sudanese sister, Nisrin.
Sorry. I think I'll just say briefly that I'm a mother of a 2-year-old, and I've been thinking a lot about the kinds of images and books and so forth that I expose her to even at this young age. And I think the same as Keisha said, I really liked what you said, can be said of us as adults, right? What kinds of social media, how do you curate your own social media? What kinds of images about Africa and about the African diaspora do you consume on a daily basis? And how can you use social media both in a positive way to sort of gain insights from perspectives that are on the continent, but also how can you filter out all the sort of negative stereotypical images and kind of portrayals of Black life in your own life. And also we need to create our own platforms and support social movements that are organizing to dismantle structural forms of racism that we rarely hear about in the media, and they're all over the place, they're everywhere.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. Now, Milton, could you please give us 1 minute of takeaway?
Absolutely. Yes, as someone who also teaches, I would like to quickly go through a couple of books I would like participants to read. Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, Kwame Nkrumah's Neocolonialism, The Last Stage of Imperialism, Decolonizing the Mind by Ngugi wa Thiong'o, and Africa's Cultural Revolution by Okot Pabita. And also, if you can, go online, go to YouTube, and listen to a 6-minute speech by Malcolm X. You can't hate the roots of a tree without hating the tree. And he's talking about how European colonial representations of Africa caused sisters and brothers in this country to be repulsed by the representations of Africa. So that's about 6 minutes. Please do that. And finally, I would also like all participants to take agency and become activists. I really mean it seriously. Engage these writers, engage the editors, engage the publishers, and challenge them. At the end of the day, we need to re-educate our people that the history that we've been taught is essentially upside down. At the end of the day, Africa is the origin of all human beings. There cannot be any other history without first African history. Thank you, sisters and brothers.
Thank you so much. But I must say that, Ben, since you came up with the story of the lion and we don't want to leave it at that, we still want to give you one, because we just don't want to hear any more about the hunter, right? So please, Ben, give us your 1 minute.
Jeff, you are very kind. There is hope. And we are no longer just victims. The powerhouses of the media that were there before can now be leapfrogged if we pull our resources together, if all well-meaning people decide to use the internet in the right way. The BBC is there. They are losing audiences. We can have our own platforms, and we can become agents of change to change the mindset, relearn, unlearn, and re-educate ourselves. There is hope. And I want to end on that optimistic note.
Thank you so much. Decolonization of minds, right? And rediscovering the beauty, the depth of the contribution of Africa to the whole human family. Thank you so much to each one of you for your significant contributions. And this conversation, of course, will have to continue on the chat. There are people who wrote that they will disseminate what they have heard because it was very informative, interesting, and even inspiring. So thank you so much. Now, I would like to ask the organizer of this webinar, because I was moderating, Ms. Kitagawa Audrey, please, you started. So the first words were yours and the last words will be yours also. Thank you so much for this invitation, and many blessings to each one of you. Continue to change the world. And as Ben, I could also say there is hope, because what is at stake is really being human and humane. So we don't want to leave this in the hands of anybody else, and nobody should be the conscience of another person and domesticate and dominate, another person. And this is what is at stake is really deeper. So thank you for each person's contribution. Audrey, the floor is yours now. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Ganoune and all of our panelists for your informative and substantively deep presentations. I have an exciting announcement of a joint program of the Anti-Racism Initiative and the Religion and Environment Working Group of the IF20, which will be hosting the next webinar on ecological racism and deep sea mining in the Pacific. It'll take place on February 16th and 17th, and we will inform you by way of flyer as to the specific times. You will be notified about this webinar and all future webinars, which will delve into issues of racism in the indigenous peoples and the residential schools, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, apartheid, and globalization, and so much more. The Anti-Racism Initiative will continue to study the systemic, structural, and institutional ways in which racism appears and affects communities and all of humankind. May our sense of fairness, justice, and dignity for all people be our guiding moral compass as we move through the world every day of our lives. Again, thank you all for joining us today, and we wish you all a safe and pleasant day. Thank you. Bye-bye.